For being here. Now, the last time we spoke was all the way back in September of 2015, and a lot has changed since then. Right now, we have a new president, Trump. Hillary did not win the White House, even though the corporate media, the government were all trying to convince us that she was going to be the next president. From what you're seeing, what do you think went wrong? Why don't you think she got into the White House? Why did Trump get into the White House?
I think that she actually lost out on a lot of Democrat votes. She got a lot less votes than Obama did in the last election. So she simply had too many of her character faults revealed to the American people, and common sense prevailed.
What we're seeing today, since she didn't get into the White House, we're seeing a lot of protests around the country. Trump has already come out and said, listen, I believe there's professional protesters within these crowds stirring everything up, creating these riots. And there's also a petition going around right now trying to get the election results overturned and have Hillary go into the White House. Where do you think this is coming from?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if it's coming from George Soros, who was Clinton's biggest backer. And a lot of the dark money can be traced directly to him. Essentially, what Soros was attempting was state capture on a grand scale, full state capture of a first world country. And that would have been the first time it had ever been accomplished at that scale, for a first world country government. For third world countries and places like South Africa, it's been tried and accomplished time and time again. But to have that happen in a first world country is unprecedented. And I think that what we're seeing right now is kind of the aftermath of that, where they're still trying to play the system to get their desired result. I don't think they'll be successful. I think that there'll probably be protests for another 2 or 3 weeks, and then they'll die down, and then we'll see another big round of protests right around the time of the inauguration. In fact, there's talk amongst the anarchists in that crowd that they want to try to shut down all the freeways and all the transportation nationwide on Inauguration Day. So I urge your listeners to be prepared for that. The other thing that people need to be prepared for is a lot of banking turmoil. I think that because the statist globalists have been foiled in their goals, they still want to see the U.S. continue along the globalist path. And I think the way that they see that best being accomplished is to prevent Trump from scaling back the U.S. government as he's promised to do. And I think the way that they're going to accomplish that is by fomenting a huge economic crisis. They'll do that by means of manipulating interest rates. It's a fairly easy thing to do. Rates have actually been artificially low for a very long time. In fact, we've gotten down into negative interest rates. So just allowing interest rates to go back to their normal level would pretty well crash the system, because the false prosperity that we've been witnessing here in the United States has been based on all the trillions of dollars of federal debt that have been racked up by the Obama administration. So there is no real recovery. There's only the illusion of a recovery created by massive federal spending and massive federal entitlements. So I think that they're going to try to crash the system. They'll try to crash the U.S. dollar, crash the U.S. stock market. They'll try to throw interest rates out of whack. And if they're successful, they could very well force the U.S. government into a near default situation, because with the $19 trillion of debt on the books, and that's just immediate obligations, not our long-term obligations, which stretch well into about $70 billion, or I'm sorry, $70 trillion, they could very well, by raising interest rates, push the U.S. government into a position where they can no longer service the national debt without resorting to inflation. And I think that is their goal. By creating economic instability, they will basically, I think they're hoping to stop Trump from scaling back the size and scope of the U.S. government, prevent him from eliminating all those federal agencies like the EPA and the Department of Education, which really are unconstitutional and which Trump has promised to do away with. If they create a crisis big enough to do that, I think their goal is to throw a monkey wrench into Donald Trump's plans. And I'm afraid they might be successful at it. So all of your listeners need to be prepared for that. And in the short term, people need to be prepared for deflation. And in the long term, they need to be prepared for simultaneous deflation and inflation. Deflation in some sectors, mass inflation in other sectors. It's going to be an unprecedented situation. It's going to be horrendous. There'll be huge job losses, huge defaults. There'll be people losing their homes in at least the deflationary stage of it. And then when we flip over into mass inflation, we'll have a situation very similar to the opening stages of my first novel series, the Patriot series.
You just said quite a bit, but I just want to back up for a second with Trump, and we can just tell that they're really afraid of him. Do you think that before he gets to January, do you think there will be an attempt on his life? Do you think they'll go down that route?
Well, I think that they won't attempt to have any kind of economic crisis until after Trump is in office, because I think especially the Democrat Party and Obama in particular is very concerned about his legacy. He's all about his legacy. And they don't want to see a crash while Obama is still in office. So if anything, I think they're going to wait until Trump is in office, but fairly soon after is when they're very likely going to pull the plug.
So do you think they'll assassinate him before he even gets into office? Do you think that's a possibility?
I don't. It's definitely a possibility. I don't think it's likely. Generally, the globalists don't do anything that overt. You know, they might carry out an assassination in a second world or a third world country, but that's very unusual in a first world country. Now, what's more likely is they could try to do a Justice Scalia style assassination where they make it look like natural causes. They could say, oh, well, President Trump was worried about his physical health and he started exercising heavily, and he was on the treadmill and he had an aneurysm and he died. Something like that. That's much more likely than having a bomb go off and taking him out that way. But they've already attempted to assassinate his character. It's not inconceivable that they might attempt to physically assassinate him.
So where does the military stand in all this? Are they behind Trump or?
Yes, I think that the military, by and large, will back Trump. And we have a very apolitical military. It's ever since World War I, the military has structured itself in such a way that they're completely divorced from politics. And that's why in a lot of countries, there's always the lingering threat of a military coup. That really doesn't exist in the United States in part because of the professionalism and the professional education of our military, which puts service to the Constitution first. And as long as we have at least a quasi-constitutional government, the military will always remain loyal to the government.
Let me ask you this. Do you think this entire election, do you think this was a silent coup in the works? I mean, we heard rumors of this where there were certain individuals.
If anything, if you want to use the term coup, it was a quiet attempted coup and then a counter coup. Because what we really have was the American electorate speaking and saying, we're tired of all this globalism. We're tired of statism. We're tired of the good old boy network. We're tired of the almost interchangeable Republican and Democrat parties. There really is not a nickel's worth of difference between the two parties at this point. They're both bloated, government oriented parties that are addicted to debt. They're addicted to big government, statism, regulation, and unfortunately, increasingly, a surveillance state. They're both fully committed to it. So I think what we saw in the election was a rejection of that whole philosophy. And hopefully, President Trump will have the opportunity to reverse a lot of that. And he'll have a bit of breathing room to make that happen. But with, my personal prediction is that they're going to foment a economic crisis that will at least delay, if not unravel completely, Trump's plans to scale back the government.
You don't think Trump will be able to stop this economic collapse that's coming right now?
No, I do not, because the collapse is long overdue. We're trillions and trillions of dollars in debt, both public and private. We have a debased currency. We have no real manufacturing base left in the country. And we have a dumbed down electorate that is dependent on not just government aid, but also medication for a huge segment of the population. So if we were to see an economic crisis, if we saw a collapse in the dollar, a spike in interest rates, a collapse in the stock market, I think our society would basically come unglued. And unfortunately, it might push President Trump into the position of actually needing more government, which is everything he stands in opposition to. If you look at the globalists and the way they've played their game for the last 50 years, they always pursue strategies and tactics that result in multiple gains. And for them, the biggest gain is more government.
When this collapse happens, do you think the corporate media, the deep state, do you think they're going to turn around and try to blame this on Trump?
Oh, of course, yes. They'll say, this is like Brexit being played out again, and the stock market instability was caused by nervousness about Trump's policies, and Trump's threat to reduce the tax base is what caused the crisis and caused a loss of confidence in the U.S. dollar. They'll blame it almost entirely on him, or they may even go all the way back to Bush. They'll just skip over the 8 years of Obama.
You talked about inflation and deflation. When we talk about inflation, how bad is that going to get for the people?
We could see at least double-digit, if not triple-digit inflation. And if it runs its own course, like it has in Venezuela, the problem with mass inflation is once it gets started, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And you have inflation built into the system. So once that steamroller gets going, it's very hard to stop it. The expectation of further inflation is inflationary just in itself.
Do you see the credit market breaking down? Because a lot of people have been talking about bare shelves in the supermarket, credit freezing up, supplies not getting to where they need to go. Do you see that occurring also?
Well, in we're going to have a really curious, unprecedented situation where we have deflation followed by mass inflation, but still some deflation in some sectors such as housing and also corporate real estate. I think will also be in a deflation. But it's going to be a strange situation where through a credit crisis, we could see liquidity dry up. But at the same time, with high interest rates, we could see price inflation at the consumer level, especially for things like food and fuel. So it's going to be a really strange situation. It's going to be a whipsaw effect where people are alternately hit by both inflation and deflation. They're going to see consumer prices go up, but their wages may actually be stagnant, and the value of their land, their property, going down. We could see deflation in that sector. So it's going to be a just absolutely terrifying situation for most Americans, and the only Americans that will be insulated from that will be Americans who have diversified into tangibles and into precious metals.
The rest of the country that they're so stuck in the system, they really haven't been preparing. They have no knowledge that this is coming. Could we see chaos on the streets, riots? Where people, get so upset and so angry. Do you see that happening?
Yes. If there's any disruption in either the supply chain to the supermarket shelves or a disruption of people's income to the point where they can't afford to buy groceries, there's nothing like hunger to inspire angry mobs. It's happened before, and unfortunately, it will probably happen again.
And how will the government react to this? What do you think they will do at that point?
Unfortunately, I think that the natural reaction will be a crackdown on the rioters and promises of an endless supply of EBT cards, where they'll create a massive dole. It'll be like the Depression of the 1930s, but inflationary. And instead of bread lines, you will have kind of a invisible depression where people are handed out EBT cards. So, right now, when you go through the checkout line of a grocery store, there's no longer the stigma of food stamps. People are using EBT cards, and you have no way of knowing when the person ahead of you in line is using a credit card or whether they're using an EBT card for their purchases. I think they'll probably push that into high gear, which unfortunately is going to result in even more government debt that will make the whole system even more unsustainable in the long term. So even if they're able to prop things up, we're going to be in a worse situation than before.
So throughout all of this, what happens to the dollar? Will the dollar still exist? Many people are talking about a brand new currency.
Yeah.
What's your view on this?
Well, I think the real goal of the globalists is to have not just electronic currencies for individual governments, but a global digital currency. And if that happens, then it'll be completely out of the control of even the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve will just be, just one member of a much larger body making monetary policy. Unfortunately, with a digital currency, you end up with a number of aberrations from the historical norm. One is you have total transparency of all purchases, which means the privacy of purchases disappears. There would be 100% tracking of virtually everything that everyone buys, and that will be added to the dossier that's already being built on every American. Not only will all of our relationships be revealed by social media, but every purchase we make will be tracked. The other scary thing about a digital currency is because it's not in minted coin and printed paper, it opens up the opportunity for governments to carry out mass inflation and simply drop a digit off the end of the currency once every few years as a hidden form of taxation. And I know that you, on your show, have many times run through that with your listeners, where you've informed them that inflation is a hidden form of taxation. With a digital currency, it becomes all too easy to do.
Yes, I agree with that. Now, I was just thinking, if the central bank, the deep state, they crash the system, do you think at that point, when everything is in chaos and the system's coming down, do you think they will make their move to take back the government, to take back the system at that point? I mean, what is the central bank going to do when this whole system's coming down? Because they're going to step forward and most likely do something.
Yeah, they'll step forward and say, "Oh, well, it's total chaos. Commerce is frozen in the United States. Nobody can get anything done. Businesses can't get loans. The consumer economy is falling apart. There's a disruption in the supply of bulk fuels, blah, 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 blah." They'll say, "We're the saviors. We're here with this new international currency unit that doesn't have the instability of the dollar. And this new unit, which we're going to refer to as the whatever, they'll pick a trendy name for it, will be the salvation of this economic dilemma." The problem is what's going to come with it is strings attached, where in effect, whoever controls the currency controls the country. And if we grant that power to a foreign entity, national sovereignty ceases to exist. And the very essence of our national government will be subsumed by a power that goes beyond nation states. I don't know whether they'll do it under the guise of the United Nations or some other body, but whatever that body is will hold the real power in the country. And everything else will simply be window dressing.
Central bankers, the deep state, in the past couple of years, and just recently before Trump was elected, they were pushing for war. I mean, to me, it was completely obvious. Most likely they were trying to get a war started with Russia, maybe China. Do you still see that we're headed towards war, or because Trump has been elected, everything is now completely changed? We're going in an opposite direction.
Things have changed slightly, but there's still war drums beating, especially in Syria and still in the Ukraine, and to a lesser extent also across the straits between China and Taiwan. I think there's still war drums beating. I don't think that war is quite as likely as it was as if Clinton had been elected, because Clinton was promising to institute a no-fly zone over northern Syria, which had a very high likelihood of bringing the U.S. into direct confrontation with Russia. I think our relations with Russia will probably be better, but again, we're talking about internationalists, statists, collectivists who are absolutely ruthless, and they don't care if it takes crashing the economy or bringing the United States into either a regional war or a third world war for the sake of them consolidating power. They're willing to do that. So we need to be prepared for that. It's if anything, your listeners need to redouble their efforts to stock up their families. It's time to stock up, team up, and train up, because the risks now are manifold. They're greater than they ever have been.
So you don't think the deep state, you don't think they're just going to retreat and say, okay, we lost this. Let's cover our tracks. Let's leave the country. We're done here. You don't think that's going to happen?
I think at this point, if you look at how overt they've become in recent years with their globalist talk, I think they're going to go all in. I think they're going to be willing to crash the system and force the hand of all of the individual nation states, and they'll try to institute a global currency and global governance in the next 10 years. And again, they have no compunctions about massive loss of life, whether that's caused by a global depression or by a world war.
How long do you think this collapse type of scenario is going to last?
Well, it all depends on how it's triggered and what the end game is, and whether or not the American people put up with it. If there is an economic collapse followed by the institution of a global electronic currency unit, it could be fairly short-lived, perhaps less than a year. If we see a repeat of the depression of the 1930s with a deflationary depression, but in this case, it'll be followed by a continuance in an inflationary depression, we could see that carry on for 10 or 20 years. It could be horrendous. We could see massive loss of life and far more than mere inconvenience for the American people. Most people don't remember it now, but there was actually considerable loss of life from starvation in the United States in the 1930s. It wasn't anything on the scale of what happened in, the Ukraine and all through Eastern Europe at the same time period, but it was still substantial. With this depression, especially given the urbanization of our society in recent years, where we have incredibly long chains of supply and literally 1% of the population feeding the other 99%, we could see massive starvation and loss of life.
So what do people have to do to prepare for this? What is the most important thing they should do at this juncture?
Well, as a Christian, I'd say about the very first important thing and most important thing is to get right with God. Following that, I think people need to prayerfully consider how they should stock up to provide for their families. They need to buy bulk foods that have long storage lives. I don't recommend necessarily buying premium food supplies, especially for someone who's on a budget. You can get by with simply stocking up on wheat, rice, beans, honey, salt in quantity. Those store for many, many years, with the exception of beans, which only have about an 8 to 10 year storage life because they get too dry to be able to cook well. All those items will store for 30 or 40 years. So the wise course of action, both to provide for food for your families and as a hedge against the coming inflation, is to buy those bulk foods now while they're inexpensive, store them in vermin-proof containers with oxygen absorber packets, and stack it deep. People need to have a deep larder at this point. They also need to arm themselves. They need to team up with their neighbors. They need to get communications equipment so they can coordinate security with their neighbors. And they need to get training in things like first aid and small unit tactics and firearms training. There's a lot that needs to be done. Most of your listeners have already heard this before. I suspect that some of them have been dawdling. The time for dawdling is over.
I understand the food, the weapon. I just want to make this clear to everyone. What is the reason to have a weapon? Why are you saying have a weapon, get training? What's the purpose?
For two reasons. One is I think we're going to be seeing a depression on the scale of the 1930s repeated. But because we have a much more urbanized society, I think there's going to be a much higher crime rate that comes out of that. Property crime is just going to be astronomical. And the people need to be prepared to defend their homes and not be dependent upon police departments and sheriff's departments. They're simply not going to be able to respond to the level of crime that's going to exist. It's going to be so widespread and of such a proportion that the police simply won't be able to keep up with a property crime. There'll be home invasions on a grand scale. So you really need to have a battle rifle or a riot shotgun to be able to defend your home. And you need the training to go along with it. I've often been quoted as saying that owning a gun doesn't make you a qualified shooter any more than owning a surfboard makes you a surfer.
When do you think this will take place? When do you think they will crash the system? What time frame? I'm not looking for a specific date and time, but when do you think this will happen?
Typically, if you look at the historic record, most crashes take place in like October, November, if you look at history. But since we're in unprecedented political times, it might be as early as January or February of next year. But my gut feeling is that the crash will occur sometime between February and November of 2017. That gives people a little bit of time to get prepared. You need to hedge. You need to hedge into small silver that you physically hold at home, perhaps a bit into Swiss francs, because I think that one of the immediate effects, just like the Brexit vote, one of the immediate effects of the Trump election is going to be a decline in the US dollar on the Forex. And one of the few currencies that will do well in that situation is the Swiss franc. And I would recommend not only for your listeners who have PayPal accounts to immediately, if they carry a positive PayPal balance, they should convert about 80% of that into Swiss francs. You can do that with just a few keystrokes by logging on to paypal.com, click on currencies, and switch the majority of your positive balance into Swiss francs. That's something they can do just minutes after listening to this conversation. And then for anyone who travels, whenever they return from any vacation trip or business trip, they should visit the international terminal of their airport and go to the foreign currency desk and trade no more than $9,000 at a time out of US dollars or the foreign currency you were traveling with and buy Swiss francs, physical francs. One other alternative is to buy Swiss francs in the form of Swiss franc denominated traveler's checks, and you can do that through any local bank with enough lead time.
Why 9,000? Why not more than 9,000?
Well, because of currency transaction reports, CTRs, that are required by the federal government, by any banking institution, and also by currency traders, that if people either withdraw or deposit physical currency in excess of $10,000, whether it's a single transaction or whether it's multiple transactions that are structured to be more than $10,000, that is a reportable event, and that's going to leave a paper trail. I would recommend that people keep the transaction level at or below around $9,000 to avoid that reporting.
James, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. Once again, how can people see your work?
Sure, they can just go to survivalblog.com. That blog has been published for about 11 years with daily updates. We have tens of thousands of articles and letters and column items that have all been archived. They're all available free of charge. There's no subscription required. There's no super secret members only area. It's all there, free for the taking. I recommend that your listeners take full advantage of the information on family preparedness that's there. Everything from food storage and first aid to gardening, heirloom seeds, home power, you name it, it's all there. Please take full advantage of that resource, folks. The time for dawdling is over.
James, once again, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight.
Thank you so much, Dave. God bless.
You too.